In the previous episodes, when looking at this footage, we were always missing textures. This time around, we can finally see progress on exactly that. Here, in the upper parts, I've started to hand paint my WoW styled textures. On the left side of the screen is the spire before texturing. On the right side is after all of the painting that I've done. This video will be cut up into a few parts. I spent a lot of time editing landscape in the previous one, so here you'll see me jump right into editing and creating some VFX. You can see them at the outskirts of the island. You will see me prepare a floating spire of the tower in Blender so I can take it into ZBrush, where I will dynamesh and boolean the different pieces together. We will sculpt on top of it, and at some point when I'm happy with how everything looks, we'll take that back into Blender. I will retopologize this incredibly dense sculpt and turn it into something more game ready. And when we're happy with that, I will start UV mapping it. Once the Retopo and the UV mapping is done, we'll head right into Painter. In there, I'll bake my mesh. I'm really after baking thickness and curvature together with ambient occlusion. Once the bake is done, I will start hand painting my textures. First, the crystal dome, colored glass. From there, I'll start sketching and hand painting an interesting golden trim ornament to go on the floor. The VFX that you see me adding comes in three different shapes. First are God rays and God planes. These are camera pointing faces that reside in a blueprint. The blueprint can be scaled differently, while the texture on top is projected and the texel density or the detail of it does not change too much. I didn't actually create from scratch this God ray and fog plane. These are blueprints that were created by Epic for Unreal Engine 4. The full name of the project is Blueprints Unreal Engine Legacy Samples. I'll have a screenshot somewhere here on the screen that will show you exactly where you can find this project, and then you could extract the two blueprints that serve this purpose of fog cards into one of your projects. Whenever I have a new project, I just reuse that and I don't waste time of setting up brand new assets. Find the link towards this project on the Unreal Marketplace in the description below. And thanks to Epic Games for creating educational pieces like those for us. The second part of the VFX that I have going on are these glowing pieces that are attached to each spire. When I create my art, I try to come up with little stories of what might be happening here or there on the different buildings, the different props, the different items that reside the world. The creators of that building made it serve them in some way. If you ask yourself the questions of what those ways might be, and you try to answer them for yourself in your mind or on your mood board, you will get some creative ideas as to how to populate or further enrich the visuals of your art. This is exactly what I did over here. I asked myself, what are these spires? What purpose do they serve? Are there energies flowing through them? Could they be gateways? How do people get up there? Do they go on their flying mount and fly up there? Or is there perhaps a gateway or a teleportation spell found nearby that can get you up there? See, I'm not going to complicate it or introduce any gameplay to what I'm saying just now, but still answering the questions and saying stuff like, well, yes, perhaps this floating spire has some type of energy attached to it, immediately leads to the logical conclusion that energy could perhaps be visualized. The energy is leaking in the air through one way or another. And what better way to do it than the WoW favorite visual style of a glowing orb or a glowing plane. I'll not cover how to create this flare tower VFX right now, but if that is something you're interested in as well, drop a comment below and I might revisit it and create a step-by-step material shader tutorial for you. Once the VFX were in place, I had another idea. This is a tower dedicated to mages, so I thought it would be fitting if I were to reuse the logo of the Kirin Tor as seen in World of Warcraft. This artwork is a fan art, so I didn't feel bad to go on the internet, dig out a World of Warcraft screenshot where we can see a flag with the Kirin Tor sigil on top. I opened that up in Photoshop and using the path tool, I slowly created a vector that outlines perfectly the symbol. I just outlined one side and then later mirrored it. Once the graphic was relatively done, I placed it on a black background while the graphic itself was white. I did a little bit of blur on the edges and I exported it as a 1K linear color black and white bitmap. This mask I then took into Unreal Engine 5, and over there I had to expand the shader logic of my glowing flare in order to give it support for custom black and white masks. Pretty cool, but you can see that it's pointing in the wrong direction. I could go back in Photoshop and rotate my texture, but that would be not great. We can see that the Kirin Tor logo is already facing a logical direction once a human is looking at it. So there isn't really a reason why I would rotate it 19 degrees clock or anti-clockwise. That would make it hard to read from the asset browser. And let's imagine that there were other 3D artists or developers that were to reuse my assets. It would make my CGO harder to reuse. As such, I immediately know that my issue lies within the plane, the 3D geometry that texture goes on. The UVs of that, or rather the entire plane, faces in the wrong axis. But that is happening because of the Niagara setup that I had for the plane always facing us a bit in the wrong way. But either way, I like the logic of the Niagara as well, so I don't really want to change the Niagara either. So that leaves me with the quick option to go into the shader logic, into the material graph, and introduce a custom rotator. So whenever someone is using this material parent, they could specify an angle of rotation for the entire UV coordinate. And after I did that, we can see the result here, which is exactly what we wanted. With the VFX at the level that I like for now, by no means finished, but still at a good enough level, next I go into my floating spire geometry in order to further refine the art of it. I really want to take it into ZBrush and to start sculpting. But there is a step before that. First we go into Blender, where I apply the different modifiers for the different parts of my spire. I clean up the geometry here and there, so there aren't nearly as many big artifacts. After the artifacts are fixed up, pieces are made to clip into one another in a predictable way, or the way I want it to be designed. I finally made sure to quote all of the geometry, or triangulate it. In this case, it doesn't really matter for me. Once all of that is done, I start moving the pieces of the floating spire into ZBrush, and then I split to similar parts using the subtool. I don't really want to merge every piece to every other piece through Boolean logic, because if I were to do that, it means later on I cannot isolate the different pieces on their own, and that means I will have incredibly hard time sculpting. Sometimes when you sculpt, you really want to go into a little corner, and that is impossible when two pieces that clip into one another are merged and Boolean together. So instead I rather keep them separate as a subtool, and then I make my way through each piece in the subtool and individually Z-remesher and Dynamesh. As such, the stone piece that looks a bit like a flower is made out of 8 rotated on an array pieces. I want to Boolean them together through Dynamesh onto one another, but I don't want any piece above them or below them Dynameshed onto them as well. because of the reasons that I already mentioned. Here I select the stone flower, and the first Dynamesh that I do is rather unsuccessful. You can see that the result looks glitchy, completely broken, vertices flying everywhere. It looks like a chocolate bar someone took a bite off of. I don't panic though. I ask myself why this might be happening, and I settle to the conclusion that the initial stone parts that I want to merge together probably have too little geometry. As such, when I press Dynamesh, it gets confused and doesn't really know how to handle it. I subdivide once to increase the amount of faces, and then I run Z-remesher. We immediately can see that the result of that is predictable and non-broken. With that working, I then run another Dynamesh. All works well, and I begin sculpting. I refine the shapes and I smooth out different parts. I'll come back later to them and give them a bit of a chiseled look, more bevels. I will use the trim dynamic brush because I cannot leave all of the different parts of the mesh overly smooth. If I do that, they will look like a clay model without details, like a child's creation with Play-Doh. With every piece dynameshed and booleaned in the way that I wanted, the first piece that I start proper sculpting on is the gold lattice. That is the top part that encapsulates the crystal dome. The brushes that I use are flattened by Ore. I'll put a link to that in the description. Trim Dynamic and the most ordinary one, clay tubes. I love relying on that very often because we don't need to accomplish anything overly complicated. Simple is sometimes good. Once the lattice is at a scope level that I like, I start the lower stone flower-like parts with all of the different spikes. All you know, in ZBrush I spent around 3 hours in order to accomplish all of the different booleans, the dynameshing and the sculpting that we saw in this time lapse here. I wanted to remind you that this is the third video in the current series. I've already published 2. Check them out over at my profile and watch them if you haven't already. If you subscribe, it will keep me going and making further ones as well. In Blender, I'll start to retopo. The goal here is to by hand create a game-ready topology that is much more sensible than what we see in the ZBrush scope. The ZBrush scope is millions of points dense that by no means is useful game mesh. In Blender, I use an add-on called Bsurfaces. That add-on allows me to quad draw in a very similar fashion to what is seen in Maya and create my geometry from scratch by quad drawing the different pieces directly onto the dense sculpture that I've exported from ZBrush. If you want to follow and know exactly the process that I use for this Retopo work, I would suggest this YouTube tutorial. It is called Retopology in Blender by CG Boost. It's incredibly well made video, straight to the point, and you can use it to learn how to do the type of work that I do here. As it is with game dev, we always come across unpredicted issues. And this was the case with my retopology work. Even though this is a process that is well ironed for me, my version of Blender 4.3 Bsurfaces refused to work. It was giving me a warning that was rather hard to understand. There aren't any strokes attached to the object. That wasn't really very descriptive, and I was pretty sure I'm doing things the way they showcase in the video and the way that I've done it in the past. After a lot of digging through the internet, I found out that the issue is the add-on being broken in 4.3 version of Blender. I had to roll back to 4.2 LTS and things worked instantly. I mean, I don't even know why I was on such brand new version. During the time of me working on this, 4.3 had been out for literally just a few days. The different parts I retopologize all follow the same logic. I start with a few strokes of the annotation tool, creating a few initial faces. Those faces then stick perfectly to the surface. From there, I start extruding upwards more and more faces, and the moment I've started to build up corners, there are specific shortcuts like pressing F in order to bring me another vertices and create a new face between the corner of the two other faces. All in all, it's a very quick and easy way to build up things. I actually find it rather fun, even though that might be controversial, because some people probably find retopologizing by hand like this to be mind-numbing. I like it, as long as you don't give me too much to retopologize. Then I'll be singing a different song. The parts that I retopo first are the crystal on the top, the star, stone flower element on the bottom. I then move on to the golden leaves, and finally I retopo some small spikes at the bottom. And with that, after a few hours of doing this, it is done. And then begins the next, even more mind-numbing for some people part. It is UV mapping. The UV mapping is pretty straightforward. My opinion is that if you create topology that is logical and sensible, it is then relatively easy to know where to insert your UV seams. I try to insert plenty of seams in places where it makes sense, so when I unwrap there is minimal amount of distortion. In general, if you don't introduce enough seams, there are higher chances for UV distortion, and that is something that we want to avoid. Once I start laying out the different UV shells onto the UV quadrant, I generally try to aim for every UV shell to be pointing in a predictable way. My rule for knowing that an UV island is pointing in the right direction is when I look at the object in the 3D viewport, I should be able to read the letters. They should not be mirrored or they should not be upside down. I want a relatively similar texel density for the different pieces. I scale all of them using the same texel density. In this case, I aim for 512 pixel density on a 4K map. I'm sure that in WoW there are probably props that have a low texel density, because texel density is a little bit more important if we were following PBR, realistic material texturing. In World of Warcraft, where things are stylized, we don't really have micro or macro details in normals or anything else in the texturing. Instead, we have broad brush strokes and hand painting. That is one of the reasons, by the way, why WoW has aged so well, because of its texture style. I ended up with 3 different texture sets, we can see them on the screen right now, and I was ready to move into Substance Painter. We are not after baking any complicated normal maps or any crazy detail from the sculpt onto the low poly. With the bake done, it is now finally time for the really fun part, and that is hand painting. My workflow here is very similar to the workflow that I would use many years ago when I was a 2D illustrator. I start with large brush strokes with airbrushes really. I want to sketch out the different colors, some highlights and some darker part. The colors might not have the correct hue or the vibrancy that I'm going for, but that does not worry or scare me, because this is my initial paint, my initial layer. I refine a bit more, I use colors that I like. I'm liking where I'm going, even though it's still looking a bit blurry, and I move and I export a version of this so I can see it in a 3D context into Unreal 5. Once I see things in there, I can note that the colors are not quite right. Some of the darks are too dark, some of the saturation is off, and in general the visual that I'm getting right now looks like some of the hand-painted textures in WoW in early 2005. Some of the Blood Elf buildings, perhaps, that is what it reminds me of. So we're going in the right direction, but we seem to be in the wrong decade. That is fine. I continue by painting more detail, tweaking the colors, taking making educated decisions after what I've seen in Unreal. I export a blue version, sparkle a bit more detail, and I paint more intricate shapes and elements. After I refine it a bit more, I also export a purple version. Next, I move on to creating a base material. This base material is a stone material with a bit of stylized noise. I pull up these different stone surfaces seen in Hollow Fall in the World Within expansion in World of Warcraft. I use those as my main point of reference to guide me to the colors, the vibrancy, and the detail that the game has. From there, I move to the final part for this video. I have a rather large stone floor, and I am worried that it is a bit too empty. There needs to be some interest, some visual flavor there. World of Warcraft, or the artists that work on it, they love adding different type of gold trims and ornaments, and that is exactly what I thought would be fun to do here. You can see this first sketch, version 1 that I do. I then decide that it's rather busy and I do version number 2, which is a bit more simple. I'm not digging it though, so I think that version number 2 is not it yet. I start onto version number 3. I am in love with this version and I start painting the different gems and the different gold spirals and leaves. I really like what is going on there, but after I showed it to a colleague of mine, she commented that on the outskirts, the way the star shape goes out, it doesn't really match the silhouette of the geometry. It gives the entire hand-painted motif a bit of an unfinished look. I thought that she's right and I will try again. And on to version number 5 we go. I strive for longer and larger strokes that give me ornaments that better match the silhouette of the stone floor. You can see with my strokes being guided by the canvas, by the shape of the floor, I immediately created something that looks a lot more elegant and a better match. I hand paint a bit highlights and a bit of shadows, and then I move it into Unreal 5 to preview and compare the old version to the new one. The new version indeed actually looks like a better fit to World of Warcraft. So after 5 different versions of me sketching, I was finally happy and I decided to leave it to that. I think that's it. We started with me shooting this footage with a bright sunlight, and well, it's not sunlight because this is the UK, with bright cloud light on my face, and now there isn't even cloud light. There's just nothing. There's just the lamp. So I think this is enough for today. See you next time. Bye.